My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask you for pardon for my sins and the grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. Over the last few days, we have been following St. Paul in the first reading of the Mass, the Apostle of the Gentiles. We have seen him preaching in many places. But that was not the only way he spread the gospel. We could get the wrong impression if we thought of St. Paul only as a preacher. If the only image we had of him was Paul evangelizing the crowds or teaching in the Areopagus in Athens or before King Agrippa. Let's make this clear. Like any apostle, St. Paul was effective not because he was persuasive, but because he was holy, because he was close to you, Jesus. At the roots of any apostolic success, there's always a life of prayer and a life of sacrifice. Today, we see one of those famous episodes in his life. In Philippi, he was arrested with Silas, and there they were flogged and imprisoned. Apostles behind bars. What can they do? Well, this is the topic of our prayer today. It is not about what they can do, it is about what they are. As I read from a letter from the prelate of Opus Dei, it is not that we do apostolate. It is that we are apostles. It is not about activity. It is about identity. Paul and Silas were giving testimony to their faith, not just by what they said, but by what they were. Jesus, help us to keep this in mind. The testimony of the first Christians that transformed the Roman Empire wasn't that they went around persuading people with their convincing speeches. Most of them never preached anything, and we don't have many writings from them. It was not what they said. It was what they did, and especially what they were. They turned the empire upside down or inside out by the testimony of their lives and of their deaths. So we see your apostle Jesus in prison today. Following the instructions we read, the guard put them in the innermost cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. So what did they do? Moan in silence and complain? Not they. Instead, we read about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. There we have Jesus, the kind of person an apostle is. Paul and Silas are bleeding in prison and singing hymns. And the other prisoners were listening to them, probably bewildered. Can you imagine what was going on in the minds of those prisoners? These guys have been stripped and beaten up with rods. They are bleeding there in the cell late at night. And what do we hear? Oi! Oh! Like moaning? No, they were singing hymns. So we can also imagine that they probably thought Paul and Silas were people worth listening to. These were unconventional prisoners. People listened to Paul and Silas not because they were articulate, but because of the kind of people they were. And that explains what happens next. Because it is not just the other prisoners. As you remember, the scene finishes with the conversion of the jailer and all his family. As they were singing hymns, we read, suddenly there was an earthquake, so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaking. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were unfastened. Then the jailer panicked and was about to kill himself, thinking they had escaped. And probably that was the wish of all the other prisoners, right? Now we're free, let's go. But you remember, Paul stopped the man. Do not harm yourself. We're all here. And when the jailer sees that it is true, that everyone is there, the first thing he says is, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" How interesting. You see, it wasn't Paul who talked to him about salvation. It was the man himself. When he saw Paul and Silas singing hymns in prison, unwilling to escape, the jailer asked about salvation. Isn't that interesting? Jesus, sometimes we imagine an apostle like a preacher, pestering and shouting that, hey, the end is nigh, and if you want to be saved, come and join us. But if we think about your first disciples, Jesus, those first Christians who transformed the Roman Empire, I imagine them more like St. Paul and Silas today. The kind of people who elicit admiration, whose lives attract others, whose bearing captivates and gets people asking them about their faith. As a priest, I say this many times. When people come for instruction, to be baptized, to get married after many years living with partners, when I see lapsed Catholics who come to prepare for their first confession or the first Holy Communion, as I had the joy of celebrating last week, when these things happen, there's always the example, the testimony of a good Christian they look up to. I have this friend whom I have known for many years now. He and his wife have a large family, and some of their children have already received beautiful vocations. Well, every now and then he drops me a line saying, "Father, I want you to meet this friend of mine. He wants to go to confession after many years." Or, "Father, I have a friend who wants to be baptized." Or wants to get married. Or wants spiritual guidance. Or wants to become a Catholic. Now, the first time I thought, well, this is great news. The second time I thought, well, this is even greater news. And the third time. But by the seventh time, I thought, this guy has something. I mean, he is on fire. And when I asked him how he did it, or what he said to them, he replied, well, I don't say anything. It is they who come to ask me questions. And talking to them, I realized he was right. They told me the same thing. This friend of mine is amazing. He's happy, he has a wonderful family and a wonderful life, and I just want something like that. Jesus, how important is the testimony of your disciples' lives? Like those words of Saint Josemaria, he writes, "How I wish your bearing and conversation were such that on seeing or hearing you, people would say, this person reads the life of Jesus Christ." That was the bearing of St. Paul and St. Silas, who made the jailer want to know their secret. That was the bearing of those first Christians in Rome and everywhere, who made people wonder, what do these people have that I don't? That bearing and conversation of yours and mine, when we give testimony to Christ with our smiles, with our patience when treated unjustly, with our charity for those who do us wrong. Mary, my Mother Immaculate, if your children behave like that, they don't need to go pestering people to bring them to your Son. The people will be coming to us to ask us, brothers, how can I be saved? How can I be happy? How can I get what you have? I give you thanks, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations that you have communicated to me in this meditation. I ask you for help to put them into effect. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.